Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'm here with the book that I read on my train back to Ottawa from Christmas vacation, which is The Curé of St. Philippe by Francis W. Gray. So I have here the New Canadian Library edition, published in 1970, which is one of the ways that you can come across this novel. It also appears to be available in several different formats online in various places for free, given that it's a very old text. It was originally published in 1899, and as far as I can tell, it hasn't been republished in a significant way since the New Canadian Library published this book, and it's number 72 in their series. So almost all New Canadian Library editions, I'm not going to say all because there could be an exception, but all the New Canadian Library editions that I've come across include an introduction written by another Canadian author or Canadian academic. And the particular introduction in this text is by R.M. Schneider. Now, Schneider makes an interesting comparison between Gray's writing style and the writing style of British author Anthony Trollope. And I have to say, I do see the comparison. The narration style is very similar, and especially when you compare this novel to Trollope's novels like Phineas Finn and Phineas Redux, you do see a few parallels, especially in the fact that Gray's novel is heavily steeped in the politics of the time. And of course, those novels by Trollope definitely deal with politics. But I wouldn't tell you to go out and read this book with the expectation that what you're getting is going to be as good as Trollope. Gray's characters are on the less interesting side. The plot is less sensational, and if you don't know Canadian politics, if you're not interested in Canadian politics, this novel is going to be more difficult to get through. The novel is set in a 3-year period surrounding the 1896 election. And one of the big political issues at the time was the Manitoba schools question. So I won't get too much into it because I'm not remembering my Canadian history, but this was essentially a debate about which language schools should be in. Did the French speakers in Manitoba have the right to a French-speaking school? Just a little interjection here from future Amy. So to explain this Manitoba school question more in detail, essentially what was happening prior to the 1896 election is that there were separate publicly funded schools for French Catholics and English Protestants within the province of Manitoba. And after this election, the Catholic French schools were no longer publicly funded, but the Protestant English schools were. Now, it's a little bit strange here in Canada because that happened in Manitoba, but in Ontario, we still have publicly funded Catholic schools. Now, many of those Catholic schools are not Francophone, they're not French, they're English, but it's sort of a curiosity of Canada's system that stuck in our Constitution still is that requirement for publicly funded Catholic schools in Ontario, but it's not a requirement in Manitoba. And so from this point on, Manitoba became, for years and years, a unilingual province. So that's a little bit of explaining there. Hopefully that helps. And so this is the issue that comes up in the novel, and it's discussed by several characters throughout. The novel is set in this fictional Quebec town of Saint Philippe. Sort of the catalyst at the beginning of the novel is the creation of the parish of Saint Philippe. Saint Philippe was previously a part of another parish, but because the parishioners had to walk 4 miles to church, and because in their own municipality they had grown to a certain population, the local bishop decided to listen to these parishioners and create this new parish of Saint Philippe. And so at the beginning of the novel, a new curé is appointed to this parish. And so along comes Abbé Lalande, who is appointed to be the curate of Saint Philippe. And he arrives not knowing the dynamics of the town. He makes an error early on when he hosts this bazaar and banquet by inviting the mayor, who comes along and buys one of everything from the bazaar and sort of, poses with people, makes himself look good. And it's essentially all for political gain because the mayor of the town is actually a Protestant. And so this new curate, Abbé Lalande, not understanding the politics of the town, makes this sort of slip early on. And throughout the novel, he struggles with these ethical dilemmas that occur when you have to navigate the politics of your community, when you have to navigate politicians themselves who are trying to use you and use your position to basically win favor and win election. There was, I'm not going to say a problem, but there was a bit of a debate within Canadian, especially French Canadian culture at the time, about the influence that religion had on politics. It was quite common, from what I understand, for a priest, for a curate, to stand up in the pulpit and to use their influence to suggest who the parishioners should vote for. And Abbé Lalande, throughout this novel, is trying to avoid doing that. He's weighing sort of these ethical dilemmas of speaking out against things that he thinks are wrong against the impression that could be taken politically from him doing so. So it's quite an interesting novel in that regard. And there are many characters throughout this novel actively trying to use members of the church, Abbé Lalande, and others actively trying to use them and their pulpit for political gain. And sort of in the background of all this, we have the politics of land ownership, the politics of development. Abbé Lalande intends to build this new church, and many of the landowners and business owners realize that wherever this new church is built, commerce is going to spring up around it and the land prices are going to go up. And so everyone is sort of quietly behind the scenes trying to get the best deal out of this. So that's going on, but then you have sort of this romance subplot that Gray explores. You have Alice Charette, who is the daughter of a landowner, and she ends up with 3 suitors who compete not only for her love and for the consent of her and of course her parents for her hand in marriage, but they are competing for position within the community, and they are using land and politics and money in an attempt to win her hand. And so even romance is not free of politics. So in that sense, you could say that this novel takes a very pessimistic approach to human nature. And this somewhat pessimistic approach makes it quite heavy to read, especially when you combine that with the heavy political content of the book. The dialogue is just steeped in political debate. People talk about politics in almost every chapter. As I said, you have the Manitoba school question. There are conversations about the role that the state should play in education and the role of the church in education, the role of the state in general and the role of the church, the role that politics should play in relation to religion. And then, of course, there's a very detailed account of the election of 1896. It's so detailed that in the introduction, Schneider actually refers to this description as excessive. He feels that Gray takes the political content of this novel to the point of excess, which is why I think it stayed a relatively obscure novel, why it hasn't traveled, beyond the borders of Canada. Because even today, because it's so heavy on the politics, it's not something that most readers would find enjoyable or accessible, I think. Despite the heaviness of its politics, though, it captures a particular style of community at a particular point in time. And it has almost a subtle humor to it that I quite enjoyed to read. That was sort of the lightness that came in spite of the heaviness. The Curé is building his church, and he is looking for topics for his sermons, and he is criticizing alcohol consumption. This is a dry town, they have prohibition in place, and he is criticizing certain styles of dance, but he has to do it in a very particular way. He is navigating this community and navigating the topic of his sermons and keeping politics in mind, that a lot of it actually comes across as quite funny. Reading the novel, it's almost as though the narrator is poking gentle fun at every last person that we encounter. So for instance here, chapter 2, the Curé organizes a bazaar. I'm just going to read you a short passage here. The highest ambition of a Canadian parish priest is to build a church. If he finds one built already, he will probably enlarge, beautify it, according to the canons of art that have weight with him. If it is very ancient, he will modernize it, to the despair of all lovers of what is old, historical, and picturesque, will even, horrible to relate, pull it down and build a new one, whereby he incurs not benedictions, but far otherwise. But his ambition is satisfied, which is always something, a point, in fact, to which we should all wish to attain if we could. The bishop does not interfere, either because his views on the church architecture coincide with those of the devastator of antiquity, or more probably because he has no time for sentiment. It is a pity, of course, but souls are not saved either by sentiment or by reverence for what is antique, possibly inconvenient if not past its usefulness. There is even excuse to be found for what some people call vandalism. As also for another form of this same ambition, that namely which urges every curé to have, if possible, a finer church than his neighbour. It is a very natural weakness after all. There are not many ways in which a priest can gratify the spirit of ambition of one kind or another with which most men are born. That a priest should wish to be known as a successful organizer, as the builder of a fine church, is surely very natural. There is nothing selfish in the strict sense about a desire of this kind. His first thought is for the church, his next for his parish. If, incidentally as it were, he secures his own advancement by zeal in a praiseworthy cause, then it is only the same as saying that he is a man. The Canadian clergy have been freely accused of burdening their parishioners with debt in order to gratify personal ambition and a spirit of emulation. It is an actuation like that of greed of excessive wealth, which has been preferred against the clergy in all ages and in all countries. And so this is almost the first impression of the new curé that we get. We get the impression that he will want to build a church, as is only natural, and we are left to suppose what his reasoning behind building that church will be. whether for personal gain, to create a good image of himself, or for his parishioners, or a mix of all of it. So overall, it was an interesting read, a little bit heavy on the politics, some of the characters not so interesting to read about, but it did have its moments.